The Secret of the Missing Countess, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The House That Held Its Breath. The village of Whitmore Crossing had not changed in 40 years, or so its inhabitants liked to believe. The elm trees along the high street still leaned toward one another, like elderly gossips exchanging confidences, and the post office still closed on Wednesday afternoons, for reasons nobody could adequately explain. Yet Whitmore Crossing possessed, at its northern edge, one establishment that had always suggested the possibility of drama. Ashenden Court, a late Victorian manor house of considerable size and considerable reputation, surrounded by walls of pale limestone that had absorbed, over the decades, something of the grey and watchful quality of the English sky above them. It was the second week of October when the Countess Valeria Southmurray Renwick invited a select group of guests to Ashenden Court for what her handwritten invitations described, in her characteristically continental manner, as a small autumn gathering of old friends and fresh conversation. The Countess herself was a woman of 63 who had been beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful, not merely in face and figure, but in bearing and certainty. She had been born in Budapest, married an English lord who had conveniently died of influenza in 1931, and had thereafter conducted her life with the cheerful autonomy of someone who had learned early that widowhood, if managed correctly, was not a misfortune but a liberation. The guests began arriving on a Thursday afternoon, their motor cars crunching over the gravel drive, while Perkins, the aged butler, stood in the doorway with the resigned expression of a man who has spent his life opening doors for people he considers his intellectual inferiors. First came Mr. Desmond Falconer, a solicitor of 51 from London, thin-faced and precise, with the careful eyes of a man who read documents for a living and had learned to distrust anything not rendered in writing. He was accompanied by his wife, Miriam, a woman 12 years his junior, whose prettiness had curdled slightly into dissatisfaction, the particular dissatisfaction of someone who had married a suitable man rather than a desired one. Behind them, in a hired motor car that showed signs of having been recently repaired, arrived Colonel Archibald Trent, retired from the Indian Army at 57, large and ruddy and loud, in the way that men who have spent years commanding others sometimes become permanently loud, as though the habit of being obeyed has calcified into an inability to modulate one's voice. The colonel arrived alone, which several of the other guests would later note. Then came Miss Isabel Quince, the Countess's companion of 8 years, a quiet woman of 45, who moved through rooms with the determined invisibility of someone who has made peace with being overlooked. She had arrived 2 days earlier, in fact, to help with arrangements, and was therefore already present when the others pulled up, standing slightly to one side of Perkins, a notebook in her hand, watching the arrivals with her characteristically neutral expression. The final guest was Mr. Roland Ashby, a young man of 28 who was, depending on whom one asked, either a portrait painter of emerging talent or a portrait painter of uncertain income. He was lean and dark, and possessed the slightly performative ease of someone who has cultivated charm as a professional tool. He had been introduced to the Countess the previous spring in London, had painted her portrait over the course of 6 weeks, and had thereafter been admitted to her circle with the warmth she reserved for people who had seen her clearly and rendered her kindly. They gathered for dinner that evening in the long dining room, where candles in silver holders threw warm, unsteady light across the faces of people who were, in their various ways, performing contentment. The Countess presided from the head of the table with her accustomed brilliance, steering conversation from topic to topic with the practiced ease of a hostess who understands that the purpose of dinner-table talk is not the exchange of information, but the management of atmosphere. It was during the fish course that Captain Renwick Sloane arrived, unannounced, which caused Perkins visible distress. He was the Countess's nephew by the marriage of her late husband's younger sister, a man of 35 with a quality of coiled impatience about him that made him seem, even when seated, as though he were preparing to stand up abruptly. He apologized for his lateness with the brevity of someone who does not truly consider themselves to have done anything requiring apology, took the chair that Perkins hastily arranged, and addressed himself to his food with concentrated purpose. The Countess greeted him with warmth that was perhaps fractionally too warm, the warmth of someone accommodating a complication rather than welcoming a pleasure. That night, after the guests had retired, the house settled into its October silence. Wind moved through the elm trees beyond the eastern wall. The long case clock in the entrance hall struck midnight, then 1, then 2. In the morning, the Countess Valeria Sathmari Renwick was gone. Her bed had not been slept in. Her jewellery, the considerable collection that she habitually wore at dinner and customarily removed at her dressing table before retiring, lay arranged in its usual order on the velvet tray. Her outdoor coat hung in the wardrobe. Her travel case stood unopened in the corner of the room. Her reading glasses sat folded on the nightstand, beside an unfinished glass of water and a novel opened face down at page 94. Everything was present. Only the Countess was absent. Miss Isabel Quince discovered the empty room at 7:45 in the morning, when she brought the Countess her customary cup of China tea. She stood for a moment in the doorway with the cup in both hands, regarding the unslept bed with an expression that her face, trained in neutrality, could not quite suppress into its usual blankness. Then she set the cup carefully on the dressing table, smoothed her skirt, and went to find Mr. Falconer, who was the most senior and most composed person she could think of. By 8 o'clock, the household was in the particular state of controlled agitation that precedes the arrival of authority. By 9 o'clock, the local police had been summoned. By 10:30, someone, it was later disputed whether it was Mr. Falconer or Captain Renwick Sloane, had thought to send a telegram to London, not to Scotland Yard, to a private address in Whitehaven Mansions. The reply came before lunch. Shall arrive by the 4 o'clock train. Please preserve everything. Poirot. Chapter 2. The Garden at Midnight. While the guests at Ashenden Court awaited the arrival of Hercule Poirot with varying degrees of relief and apprehension, Inspector Hugh Crail of the Whitmore Crossing Constabulary conducted his own investigation with the methodical thoroughness of a man who has learned, through long experience, never to contaminate his conclusions with imagination. Inspector Crail was 50, stocky, with a grey moustache and the unhurried manner of someone who has observed that events, if given sufficient time, tend to explain themselves. He was not a stupid man. He was, however, a man whose intelligence operated most comfortably within established channels, and the disappearance of a continental countess from a locked English manor house was not, strictly speaking, an established channel. He began with the ground floor. The front door had been locked and bolted from within. Perkins confirmed this and produced both the key and the drawn bolt as evidence, with the careful pride of a man presenting exhibits. The French windows in the drawing-room were latched from inside. The kitchen entrance, used by the 2 daily women who came up from the village, was locked. The garden door on the eastern side, which the Countess had used the previous summer, when she was in the habit of walking before breakfast, was also locked. But here Inspector Crail paused, because the key was not hanging in its usual place on the hook beside the door. The key was not hanging anywhere. It was not on the floor. It was not in any visible pocket or drawer. The key to the eastern garden door had simply vanished, along with the Countess. The garden itself, when Crail examined it in the thin October morning light, offered one additional detail. Below the eastern wall, a wall of perhaps 8 feet in height, with an ornamental iron gate set into it that led to the outer grounds, the earth of the flower border was disturbed, not dramatically, not in the manner of a struggle or a desperate flight, rather in the manner of someone who had stepped, carefully and deliberately, from the garden path onto the softer ground of the border and then stepped back again. or, conceivably, had been lifted from that spot. The gardener, an elderly man named Birch who lived in the cottage at the property's edge, had been in his cottage all evening and had heard nothing. This was, he noted with some dignity, because he was slightly deaf and had additionally been listening to the wireless, which was louder than usual because the aerial had shifted. The guests, interviewed in the morning room one by one with a constable present to take notes, offered Inspector Crail the following information in the following order. Miss Isabel Quince stated that she had bid the Countess good night at approximately 10:45 at the foot of the main staircase. The Countess had seemed perfectly well, perhaps slightly tired, but nothing more. She had mentioned nothing unusual, made no reference to any concern or difficulty, and had expressed, if anything, the mild satisfaction of a hostess whose evening has gone adequately. Desmond Falconer reported that he had spoken briefly with the Countess after dinner, in the drawing-room, on the subject of a small property matter she had mentioned wishing to discuss during the visit. The conversation had been preliminary and had been interrupted by Colonel Trent, requiring someone to settle a point about railway timetables. He had assumed they would continue the conversation the following day. Miriam Falconer said she had gone to bed at 10:15 because she had a headache and had taken one of her tablets and had slept without interruption until morning. She said this with the slightly rehearsed clarity of someone anticipating that their account will be doubted. Colonel Trent stated that he had remained in the drawing-room after the others retired, finishing a whiskey and soda and reading a sporting magazine until approximately 11:30. He had then gone up to bed. He had noticed nothing unusual. He had heard nothing. He slept, he said, like a log. Always had. India or England made no difference. Roland Ashby said he had gone directly to his room after dinner, feeling tired from the journey, and had read until he fell asleep. He could not be precise about the time. He thought perhaps 11. He had heard, now that the inspector mentioned it, the sound of footsteps in the corridor at some point, but the house was large and old and always made noises, and he had thought nothing of it. Captain Renwick Sloane said, with considerable brevity, that he had gone to bed at 10, that he was a sound sleeper, and that he had nothing further to add. He then looked at Inspector Crail with the expression of a man who considers the interview concluded and is prepared to enforce that conclusion by force of personality alone. It was Roland Ashby, and this detail Crail noted carefully, though he did not yet know what to make of it, who mentioned, as though as an afterthought, that he had looked out of his bedroom window at approximately midnight to close the curtains against the wind, and had seen, in the garden below, a light, small, moving, brief, gone within seconds. He had assumed it was Perkins or one of the household checking something, and had drawn the curtains and gone back to his book. The bedroom from which Roland Ashby would have seen this light was on the northeast corner of the house. The eastern garden door was directly below. Inspector Crail was still considering the geometric implications of this fact when, at 4:17 in the afternoon, a small, immaculate figure descended from the Whitmore Crossing railway platform and stood for a moment in the thin autumn sunshine, regarding the waiting police motor car with an expression of mild approval. "Inspector Crail," said Hercule Poirot, shaking hands with the precision of a man who has given considerable thought to the mechanics of greeting. "Excellent. You have preserved the scene, I hope." "Everything's as it was, Mr. Poirot." "Bien. And the guests?" "Still at the house. I asked them to remain." Poirot's small moustaches adjusted themselves very slightly upward. "Then let us not delay. I find, Inspector, that atmosphere is a substance as fragile as morning mist. It disperses with time." He settled himself into the motor car with the care of a man arranging a museum exhibit. "Tell me everything from the beginning. Leave nothing out, including things that seem to you unimportant. It is very often the unimportant things that are most important of all." Chapter 3. The Arrangement of the Little Grey Cells. Poirot's first act upon arriving at Ashenden Court was not, as Inspector Crail had anticipated, to examine the eastern garden door, or the Countess's bedroom, or the disturbed earth in the flower border. It was to stand in the entrance hall for approximately 4 minutes, quite still, his eyes moving slowly around the space with the systematic attention of a camera conducting a survey. Perkins watched this from his position near the drawing-room door, with the polite bewilderment of a man unsure whether to offer refreshment or remain silent. Poirot examined the long case clock. He noted the arrangement of the coat hooks near the door and the absence of one coat that Perkins confirmed had belonged to the Countess. He observed the surface of the hall table, on which lay several items: the house's telephone directory, a silver calling card tray containing 3 cards, a pair of women's gloves of pale grey suede. He picked up the gloves and examined them with care. "These belong to the Countess?" "Yes, sir. She left them there yesterday evening, after returning from a brief walk before dinner." "Before dinner? What time was this walk?" "She returned at approximately 6:15, sir. Dinner was at 7:30. "And she went out by which door?" "The front door, sir. She frequently took the lane toward the village." "She returned through the front door also?" Perkins paused, the fractional pause of a man suddenly uncertain of something he had not previously considered uncertain. Yes, I believe so, sir. I admitted her myself." "You believe so?" Poirot set the gloves back on the table with the precision of someone replacing an exhibit in a museum case. "And yet she left her gloves in the hall, which suggests she removed them there upon returning." "Good. Now, her bedroom, if you please." The bedroom was large, south-facing, furnished in the comfortable manner of the Edwardian period with some later additions. The unslept bed, with its counterpane undisturbed, its pillows still squared, struck Poirot with the same force that it had struck Miss Quince, though his reaction was internal and therefore invisible. He moved through the room slowly, touching nothing, simply looking. The wardrobe stood open, and Poirot examined its contents with care. 3 evening dresses, 2 day dresses, a tweed walking suit. The coat that Perkins had confirmed was absent from this wardrobe. A dark wool coat suitable for cold weather was what Inspector Crail had already noted missing. Its absence was the one fact that suggested the Countess had left the house in deliberate preparation rather than in haste or under compulsion. But the jewels on the velvet tray. Poirot stood before the dressing table and examined them without touching them. Pearl necklace, diamond ear clips, a heavy gold bracelet with a rectangular sapphire, a ring of carved amber. "She wore these at dinner?" he asked, without turning. Inspector Crail, who had followed him into the room, confirmed it. Falconer's wife mentioned it specifically, said she'd noticed them because the diamond clips were particularly fine, and yet they are here, arranged carefully on the tray, as one arranges one's jewellery when one is preparing for bed. Poirot turned. "A woman who leaves her house voluntarily in the night, who takes her coat, does not leave her jewellery. A woman who is taken by force has not the opportunity to arrange her jewellery on a velvet tray in the precise pattern of a woman performing her nightly ritual." Crail considered this. "So she intended to come back? Or," said Poirot quietly, "the jewellery was arranged by someone other than the Countess. After she was gone." He said nothing more on this point. He asked to be taken to the garden. The eastern garden was enclosed on 3 sides by the limestone wall and on the 4th by the rear facade of the house itself. In October, it presented the particular melancholy of a garden at the end of its season, the flower borders stripped back, the rose canes tied in, the stone urns empty of their summer geraniums. The path ran in a rectangle around a central lawn, and it was at the point where the path met the eastern border, nearest the wall, that the disturbed earth was visible. Poirot crouched, with some care, his knees having their own opinions about such manoeuvres, and examined the disturbance. 2 clear impressions in the soft soil, the heel marks of a woman's shoe, size small, the toes pointing toward the wall. Beside them, slightly overlapping, another impression, heavier, broader, a man's shoe, Poirot estimated, size 10 or thereabouts, also pointing toward the wall. "The iron gate in the wall," Poirot said, straightening. "It is usually locked, yes. The key hangs in the estate office, according to Birch the gardener. He uses it to bring in materials from the lane beyond. And is the key there now?" A pause. "No, Mr. Poirot. We checked. It's gone as well." Poirot looked up at the wall. He looked at the gate, iron, ornamental, perhaps 7 feet high. He looked at the ground on the far side, visible through the ironwork. A lane, running parallel to the property. A lane along which, on a moonless October night, a motor car could travel without observation from the house. "Has anyone," Poirot said thoughtfully, "inquired at the village whether a motor car was heard or seen on this lane during the night?" Inspector Crayle's expression confirmed that this had not yet occurred to him. "Perhaps," Poirot said, with the gentle courtesy of a man tactfully declining to press a point, "that might be attended to." He turned back toward the house. "And now, I think, I will speak with the guests," he began, not with Captain Renwick Sloane, as Crayle had expected, and not with the solicitor Falconer, as logic might have dictated. He asked instead to speak with Miss Isabel Quince. Chapter 4. The Companion's Careful Silence. Miss Isabel Quince sat in the small sitting room that the Countess had reserved for private conversation, a room at the rear of the house, with a view of the garden wall, and arranged her hands in her lap with the patience of someone who has spent years learning to wait. Poirot observed her for a moment before speaking. She was a woman who had been overlooked for so long that she had learned to use her invisibility as a kind of shelter. But shelters, Poirot reflected, are only necessary when there is something to protect. "You were companion to the Countess for 8 years, Mademoiselle Quince." "Yes. That is a long time. You knew her well. I knew her schedule, her preferences, her requirements." A pause. "Whether I knew her, in the deeper sense, is perhaps a different question." Poirot inclined his head. He appreciated the distinction. "Let us begin with what you observed. You brought her tea at 7:45. Tell me precisely what you saw when you entered." Miss Quince described it with the controlled thoroughness of someone who has replayed the scene many times already. The unslept bed, the jewellery on the tray, the reading glasses beside the untouched water glass. "The water glass," Poirot said. "Was it half full or less?" She considered this with the seriousness it deserved, rather more than half, as though she had poured it freshly and drunk very little. "And the novel? You noted it was open and face down. Can you tell me which page?" Miss Quince blinked. No, I'm afraid I can't. I noticed only that it was face down." "No matter. Continue." "She had touched nothing in the room," she said. She had understood immediately that something was seriously wrong, not because she was imaginative, but because the Countess was a creature of habit, whose morning ritual was as fixed as a liturgy, and an unslept bed at 7:45 was not merely unusual but impossible to account for innocently. "Did the Countess," Poirot said carefully, "seem to you, during the previous day or the preceding days, to be concerned about anything, troubled?" The pause that followed was 3 seconds longer than it should have been. "She seemed," Miss Quince said finally, "as she always seemed." "Which is not," Poirot observed mildly, "quite an answer to my question." Miss Quince's hands shifted slightly in her lap. She had received a letter 4 days before the guests arrived. I don't know its contents. I never read her correspondence. But she read it twice at the breakfast table, which she did not normally do with letters. And then she burned it in the fireplace. She did not normally burn letters. Do you know who it was from? The handwriting on the envelope was not one I recognized. The postmark, London. And after this letter, her manner changed. She was more attentive, more watchful during the subsequent days. When the guests arrived, she observed them more carefully than usual, as though she were looking for something. Poirot considered this. Captain Renwick Sloane, when he arrived unannounced at dinner, how did she react? Miss Quince's composure held but just. She was surprised, pleasantly surprised. She was accomplished at appearing pleasantly surprised. But in your estimation, which has 8 years of observation behind it, was she genuinely pleased to see him? No, said Miss Quince, and the single syllable came out with the relief of something long compressed. He was invited to this gathering. He was not. He simply arrived. Poirot stood and moved to the window, looking out at the garden wall. The October sky beyond was the colour of pewter. One final question, Mademoiselle Quince. The Countess, was she a woman who would leave her house voluntarily, at night, without her jewellery, without telling anyone, without leaving any message? Never, said Miss Quince with absolute certainty. Never in 8 years. Merci, said Poirot. He turned from the window. You have been most helpful, and I note that you have been most careful also, which is its own form of helpfulness. She looked at him with an expression he found interesting. Not the look of someone who has concealed nothing, but the look of someone who has concealed one specific thing and is not yet certain whether the time for concealment has passed. He filed this observation with precision in the cabinet of his little grey cells and went to speak with Desmond Falconer. Chapter 5. The Solicitor's Inconvenient Papers. Desmond Falconer received Poirot in the library with the controlled courtesy of a man who has spent his professional life in rooms where his authority was understood, and who finds it mildly disconcerting to be questioned in a room that is not his. He was precise in his dress, precise in his posture, and precise in his account of the previous evening, which he delivered with the verbal accuracy of a man accustomed to giving testimony. He had spoken with the Countess after dinner on a minor property matter. He had gone to bed at 11. He had slept uninterrupted. He had noticed nothing unusual. Poirot listened with his eyes slightly closed and his fingertips pressed together. "This property matter," he said, when Falconer had finished. "You are the Countess's solicitor." "I am. Have been for 11 years. And it was in connection with her estate that she invited you this weekend." A slight hesitation. "It was one of the reasons, yes. One of the reasons. What were the others?" "We are also friends of long standing. The Countess is a woman who values personal connection in business relationships." Poirot noted the stumble over tense and did not comment on it. "This property matter, would you describe it?" Falconer placed his fingertips together in an unconscious mirror of Poirot's own gesture. "That's a matter of professional confidence, Mr. Poirot. The Countess is missing, Mr. Falconer. Professional confidence becomes a somewhat more elastic concept under such circumstances." A pause, in which the solicitor weighed several considerations against one another. "She had intended to revise her will," he said at last. "Substantially revise it. She had written to me 3 weeks ago with her instructions. I was to bring the new draft for her to review and sign. And the revision, in what direction did it move? From the existing beneficiaries toward a new one. Who is the existing primary beneficiary?" Falconer looked at his hands. Captain Renwick Sloane. Poirot was still for a moment. And who was to be the new primary beneficiary? She had not told me specifically. She had written that she would explain the full details when I arrived. In her letter, she referred only to a more deserving recipient, and a matter of justice long overdue. I took this to mean a charitable bequest of some kind, but I confess I was not certain. "You brought the draft?" "Yes. It is in my briefcase in my room. In its revised form, partial, pending her instruction, it effectively reduces Captain Renwick Sloane's inheritance from the primary estate to a specific bequest of the London flat only. He knew of this intended revision, not from me, and from the Countess." The solicitor looked up. "I cannot say. She may have told him. She may have told no one. She had the continental taste for secrecy in personal matters." Poirot looked at the bookshelves with the abstracted gaze of a man whose attention is oriented entirely inward. "One more thing. The Countess, in your 11 years' acquaintance, did she seem to you to have enemies, people who resented her or feared her?" Falconer considered this with visible sincerity. She was a woman of considerable wealth and considerable character, Mr. Poirot. Such women collect both admirers and resentments in roughly equal measure. He paused. But I would not have described her as being in any danger. Not until— He stopped. Until the letter, Poirot said quietly. Falconer stared at him. I beg your pardon. She received a letter 4 days before this gathering. She burned it afterward. Yes, she mentioned it to me, in fact, briefly. She said she had received a communication that had surprised her. She said she was considering how best to respond. He hesitated. She used an unusual phrase. She said, "One cannot always outrun the past, Desmond, but one can sometimes face it on one's own terms." Poirot repeated this phrase silently to himself. He stood, thanked Falconer with his usual courtesy, and went to speak with Colonel Trent. Chapter 6. The Colonel's Missing Hour. Colonel Archibald Trent occupied the chair in the morning room, as he occupied most spaces, comprehensively, as though he had claimed and annexed it by force of personality alone. He had a drink beside him, which, given that it was 11:30 in the morning, Poirot noted without comment. "Damnably odd business," the Colonel said, before Poirot had settled himself. "Can't make head or tail of it. Woman doesn't simply evaporate." "Indeed she does not," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "Which is why I am here." He allowed the Colonel to repeat his account of the previous evening, which matched what he had told Inspector Crail with the exactness of a rehearsed speech. Remained in the drawing-room, finished his drink, read a magazine, retired at 11:30. "The magazine," Poirot said. "Which one?" The Colonel blinked, horse and hound. "I brought it from London." "And did you finish the article you were reading?" Yes, I think so." "You think so, or you know so." A pause. "I finished it, I'm fairly certain." "During your time in the drawing-room, did you hear anything? The clock in the hall? Movement on the stairs?" "Nothing at all." "You mentioned to Inspector Crail that you sleep like a log. Has this always been the case?" The Colonel shifted. "For the most part. Had the odd, difficult night in India, naturally. But as a rule—" "In India?" Poirot said, in the tone of a man conversing about the weather. "You served with the Colonel Renwick Sloane, with the father of our Captain Renwick Sloane, I believe." The shift this time was more than physical. It was the shift of a man reassembling his expressions around a new circumstance. "Gerald Renwick Sloane, yes. Knew him at Poona. Good man. Died in 1938. "And you knew the captain as a boy?" "Saw him once or twice. Boy of 12, 13. Thin child, clever. Too clever, his father used to say." A pause. "I haven't seen him since Gerald's funeral. Surprised to find him here." "And the Countess? How long have you known her?" "Oh, years. Met her through Gerald originally. She was the widow of Renwick. Gerald's cousin, you understand. Family connection. But you have remained friendly with her, independently of that connection. She's an interesting woman. Was. Is." He caught the tense problem and covered it with a harumph. "She invited me. I came. Nothing complicated about it." There was, Poirot thought, something enormously complicated about it, but he allowed the Colonel to believe otherwise for the moment. "Between 11 and 11:30, he said, "when you rose from the drawing-room to go to bed." "Did you pass through the hall?" "Naturally. The stairs are in the hall." "And you saw nothing there? No one?" The Colonel looked at him steadily. "No one. The coat hooks near the door, did you notice them?" A fractional pause. "I wasn't looking at coat hooks at 11:30 at night." "Of course not," Poirot agreed agreeably. "One final question, Colonel. You said you arrived here yesterday afternoon, but I understand from Perkins that you had in fact telephoned the house the previous evening, the Wednesday, to confirm certain details of your arrival." The Colonel's colour, which was already considerable, deepened. "Did I? Yes. I suppose I might have. Standard courtesy." "Who took the call?" "Perkins, I imagine." "Perkins says it was the Countess herself who took it, and that the call lasted 20 minutes. Silence in the morning room. A coal settled in the grate. "We had things to discuss," the Colonel said. "Old acquaintances. Nothing remarkable about a long telephone call." Poirot regarded him with the benign attention of a man who has all the time in the world. "Of course not," he said, and thanked the Colonel for his time. Outside in the corridor he paused for a moment, absolutely still, organising the morning's observations into the architecture he was constructing in his mind. The building was taking shape. There were several walls still missing, but he could see now where the doors were, and that is always the beginning. Chapter 7. The Painter's Peculiar Eye. Roland Ashby was the only guest Poirot had not yet spoken to, who seemed, when informed that the detective wished to see him, neither relieved nor apprehensive, but merely curious, a quality that Poirot found at once refreshing and worth examining. They met in the conservatory, where the last of the season's geraniums were struggling bravely in their pots. Ashby sprawled in a wicker chair with the easy physicality of a young man who has not yet learned the social advantages of stillness, and examined Poirot with the frank evaluating gaze of a painter. "You have an interesting face," Ashby said. "I am told this often," Poirot replied, "usually by people who are deciding how much to tell me. Now, you saw a light in the garden shortly after midnight." Ashby straightened slightly. "Yes, I mentioned it to the inspector. Describe it again, with greater precision," the young man thought. He was, Poirot noted, someone who took the idea of accuracy seriously, either because he was honest or because he was clever enough to know that honesty and precision were not always the same thing. It was a small light, moving slowly, low to the ground, rather like a pocket torch, held downward to illuminate the path. It was visible for perhaps 5 seconds, then gone. "Moving in which direction?" "Toward the eastern wall, I think. It was dark, and I was at the window to close the curtains, not to observe. I might be wrong about the direction." "But you are not wrong about the light itself." "No, absolutely not." Poirot looked at the dying geraniums. "You painted the Countess's portrait this spring?" "Yes, over 6 weeks in London, at her Belgrave Square flat. During those 6 weeks, you came to know her, as well as one knows a subject, which is a peculiar kind of knowing, very particular, like knowing the geography of someone's face without knowing the territory of their thoughts. Nevertheless, did she speak to you about her life, her family, her financial arrangements?" Ashby tilted his head. "She spoke a great deal, in the way people do when they are sitting still for long periods, about her youth in Budapest, about England and what she thought of it, affectionately, critically, the way you love a place you weren't born to, about her late husband, rarely and without regret, about Captain Renwick Sloane once, briefly. What did she say about him? That he reminded her of his father, and then she fell silent in a way that suggested this was not a compliment." Poirot sat very still. "Did you have any sense, during those weeks, that she was concerned about anything, that she felt herself under any pressure or threat?" "Not then, no." A pause. "But when I arrived here yesterday, I thought she looked differently. Not frightened. She was not the sort of woman who showed fear directly, but watchful, like a chess player who sees the board shifting in an unwelcome direction and is deciding which piece to move. When you spoke with her yesterday evening, before dinner or after, did she say anything to you specifically?" Ashby was quiet for a moment. "After dinner. We were in the drawing room, and she moved to stand beside me for a moment, quite naturally, as though simply circulating, and she said, very quietly, 'Roland, you have good eyes. If you notice anything this evening that seems to you out of the ordinary, remember it.' And then she moved on and spoke to Colonel Trent about horses." Poirot looked at him steadily. "And did you notice anything?" "At the time, I noticed nothing except that she had said something peculiar. Afterward, after she was gone, I remembered the light in the garden." "You did not go to the garden yourself, after seeing the light?" "No." He looked down at his hands, a painter's hands, ink stained at the right forefinger. I think I should have. I think she may have wanted me to. You believe she knew something was going to happen. I believe she was a woman who was 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room, and I believe that on this occasion either she miscalculated or she intended for something to happen. On her own terms, as she might say. On her own terms. The same phrase, nearly, that Falconer had reported. Poirot filed it with care. One more thing, Mr. Ashby. You said Captain Renwick Sloane arrived unannounced. How did the other guests receive this? The young man smiled slightly. Falconer looked careful, the way solicitors look when something is legally inconvenient. Miriam Falconer looked at her husband to see how to react. Colonel Trent went very red and very still for a moment, which is unusual because he is a man who tends toward noise, and Miss Quince poured the captain a glass of water and did not look at him at all. Poirot rose. You have, as I suspected, a very good eye. I paint people, Ashby said simply. You learn to look. Chapter 8. The Weight of Inheritance. Captain Renwick Sloane was the last person Poirot spoke to that day, and he was, without question, the most difficult. He sat across from Poirot in the library with the contained energy of a man who has decided in advance that he will not be managed, and regarded Poirot with a directness that stopped just short of hostility. I've told the inspector everything I have to tell, he said. Indulge me, Poirot replied, pleasantly. I am an old man with simple methods. I ask questions. I listen. It is not very dramatic, but it has served. Renwick Sloane's account of the previous evening was the briefest Poirot had heard. To bed at 10. Slept soundly. Knew nothing. He delivered it with the clipped economy of a military briefing. You arrived unannounced, Poirot said. The invitation had been extended verbally. I didn't realize RSVP was required. What invitation? A pause. My aunt mentioned the gathering. In a letter. She wrote to you about the gathering but did not formally invite you. The distinction escapes me. Poirot looked at him with the gentle patience of a man waiting for an animal to stop pretending it has not noticed the trap. When did you last see your aunt before last evening? 6 months ago, in London. The relationship between you, it was close. She was my uncle's widow. We maintained a connection. A warm connection? A respectful one. She was, Poirot said carefully, a wealthy woman. The captain met his gaze. She was. And you are her principal heir. I have been told I am a significant beneficiary of her will, yes. Have you been told, Poirot said, his voice perfectly level, that she was in the process of revising that will? Something moved in Renwick Sloane's face, not quite surprise, not quite anger, but something between them that had the quality of a thing that has been anticipated and is therefore less of a shock than it might otherwise have been. I had heard a suggestion to that effect. From whom? My aunt herself. She wrote to me approximately 3 weeks ago. The letter was oblique. She said she was considering certain adjustments to her estate arrangements and that she felt I should be made aware. She did not specify the nature of the adjustments. And this did not alarm you. It prompted me to come here and have a conversation with her. Poirot let the silence rest for a moment. Tell me, he said quietly. Did you have that conversation? Renwick Sloane looked at the window. Rain had begun against the glass, soft and insistent. I attempted to. Last night, after dinner, I asked to speak with her privately. She was not unpleasant, but she was non-committal. She said we would discuss it the following morning, when she had rested. And then she said good night and went upstairs. I went to my room, not at 10 o'clock, as you told Inspector Crail. A long pause. Poirot could hear the rain, and the fire in the grate, and the long case clock in the hall. Perhaps a little later, the captain said at last. What time? 11. 11:15. You lied to Inspector Crail, I simplified. I didn't think the precise time was relevant. Poirot regarded him. Captain Renwick Sloane, your aunt is missing. The circumstances suggest something very grave may have occurred. In such circumstances, every minute is relevant. Every movement, every word, every adjustment to the truth has weight. He stood. You will, I hope, recall any further simplifications and correct them. He left the library and stood for a moment in the corridor, listening to the rain against the stone of Ashenden Court. The picture was nearly assembled, but there were still pieces missing. Among them the most important piece of all. Not who, not how, not where, but why. Not the obvious why, the deeper one. The one that Valeria Sathmari Renwick had been carrying, apparently, for a very long time. Chapter 9. Matters Beneath the Surface. That evening, Poirot declined dinner at the table with the guests, and took a tray instead in the small sitting room, preferring the company of his own thoughts to the spectacle of 5 people performing ease at a meal that none of them felt easy about. He had, in the interval between his last interview and the dinner hour, done several things. He had examined the novel on the Countess's nightstand. It was a translation of a Hungarian work, and the page at which it lay open was page 94, which Poirot found interesting because on page 94 a character received news that altered the entire meaning of what had come before. He had spoken at length with Perkins about the household routine. He had asked Constable Meadows, who had been stationed at the house by Inspector Crail, to conduct a quiet inquiry in the village about any motor traffic observed on the lane behind the eastern wall the previous night. The constable returned at 7:15 with information that Poirot found both expected and clarifying. A farmer named Hobson, whose property backed onto the same lane, had been in his barn at approximately 11:45 the previous night, attending to a cow in some distress. He had heard a motor car on the lane, a sound unremarkable in itself, but notable because the lane was a private road, rarely used after dark. The car had stopped somewhere along its length for perhaps 5 minutes, and had then driven on, south, toward the Whitmore Crossing Road. One car, southbound. At approximately 1:45. Poirot sat in the small sitting room with his tisane and arranged the facts. The Countess had, on the evidence of her conversation with Ashby, anticipated some kind of event and wished to face it on her own terms. She had burned a letter from London, in an unrecognised hand, which had made her watchful and attentive. She had engaged Falconer to prepare a new will, disinheriting Renwick Sloane, without yet specifying the new beneficiary. She had invited, to this gathering, 4 people who each had some distinct connection to her: her solicitor, her companion, a young painter who had seen her clearly, and a retired soldier with a family connection. Renwick Sloane had arrived uninvited, having been informed of the gathering. By whom? He claimed by his aunt's letter. But the Countess, in Miss Quince's assessment, had not been pleased to see him. The eastern garden door, the missing key, the 2 sets of footprints, the light Ashby had seen moving toward the wall, the 5-minute pause of a motor car on a dark lane, and the jewels, arranged carefully on the velvet tray. Poirot set down his tisane. The jewels. He thought about the jewels for a very long time. Then he rose, went to the window, and stood looking at the dark garden, with an expression on his face that, had any of the guests seen it, might have surprised them. Not the expression of a man assembling a puzzle, but the expression of a man who has assembled it and is deeply sorry about what it shows. He asked Perkins, when the butler appeared to collect the tray, to arrange that all guests and household members be present in the drawing-room the following morning at 10 o'clock. All of them, sir? All. A pause. And please ensure that Constable Meadows remains in the house overnight. Perkins, who had spent 60 years observing human nature through the medium of domestic service, asked no further questions. He simply said, "Very good, sir," and meant it with every atom of his professional soul. That night Poirot did one more thing. He knocked quietly at the door of Miss Isabel Quince's sitting room. She opened it promptly. A woman who is not sleeping does not need to be woken. "There is something you have not told me," Poirot said gently from the doorway. "I believe you know it is time." She looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a woman who has been waiting for permission. "Come in," she said. "I'll tell you about the letter." Chapter 10. What Miss Quince Knew. She told it quietly, without drama, in the manner of someone who has constructed the account in her head many times already, and is grateful, at last, for the opportunity to deliver it to someone qualified to receive it. The letter that had arrived 4 days before the guests, the one the Countess had burned, had not been entirely unread by Miss Quince. She had not read it deliberately. She had entered the breakfast room to tell the Countess that the telephone had rung, and she had seen the letter open on the table, and she had seen, she could not entirely help seeing, 3 lines of its content before the Countess folded it. The 3 lines were, "Know what you did in the summer of 1928. I have waited because silence served me then, it serves me no longer. I intend to speak." Then the Countess had looked up and seen her companion in the doorway, and had folded the letter with no particular haste or embarrassment. The composure of a woman who has decided in advance how she will behave in every contingency. She said nothing, Miss Quince said. Not about the letter. She received the telephone message. It was from her hairdresser, and sent her apologies and went on with her breakfast. "But you knew," Poirot said. "I knew she was troubled. And the summer of 1928, did that year mean anything to you?" Miss Quince folded her hands. She had been with the Countess only since 1935, she said. But she had, over 8 years of close association, formed a picture of the Countess's earlier life, assembled from remarks, from photographs, from the particular silences that surround certain topics. In 1928, the Countess had been 35. Her husband, Lord Renwick, had been 61 and in poor health. They had spent that summer at the family estate in Dorset. With them had been the husband's cousin, Gerald Renwick Sloane, later Colonel Trent's comrade in India, father of the captain. Gerald Renwick Sloane had died that August, at the estate, of what was determined to be a heart attack. He had been 38 years old. He had been, according to the one photograph the Countess kept from that period, a group photograph, found by Miss Quince in the back of a drawer when arranging papers for the Countess's accountant, a lean, sharp-faced, apparently healthy man. He died at the estate, Poirot said slowly, with only the Countess and her husband present, and the household staff. Yes. And Gerald Renwick Sloane was the primary heir to the Renwick estate, ahead of Lord Renwick himself. I believe so, though I cannot be certain. And with Gerald's death, Lord Renwick inherited directly. And when Lord Renwick died 3 years later, his widow, the Countess, inherited everything. The room was very quiet. She never spoke of that summer, Miss Quince said. In 8 years, not once. Poirot sat very still for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was entirely neutral, the voice of a man who has suspended personal judgment in favour of professional clarity. The letter, the someone who had waited because silence served them. Do you have any idea who could have written it? Someone who was there, Miss Quince said. Someone who saw, or suspected, something in that summer of 1928, and who had, as the letter said, remained silent until now. A member of the household staff, perhaps, grown old and, what? Dying, feeling the weight of an old wrong, or been discovered by someone else, who then... He stopped. Or, Miss Quince said in her precise, quiet way, someone who had always known and had been profiting from that knowledge, and whose payments had ceased, or whose demands had increased. Poirot looked at her with something approaching admiration. You have thought about this very carefully. I have been thinking of little else since Friday morning. One more question. The morning you found the room empty, you said you touched nothing, but you examined the room. Did you look in the wardrobe? Yes. Was there anything missing beyond the coat? She was still for a moment. There was a box, she said, on the shelf above the dresses, a black lacquered box. About so large. She indicated with her hands a rectangle perhaps 12 inches by 8. The Countess kept private papers in it. It had a small lock, and she kept the key on her person. And the box? It was gone. Poirot nodded once, as a man nods who has been given the final piece of a complex equation. He thanked her, went to his room, and did not sleep for a very long time. Chapter 11. The Geography of an Old Crime. By 9 o'clock the following morning, Poirot had asked Inspector Crail to make 2 telephone calls, one to the Dorset Constabulary and one to a contact in London whom Crail did not know, but whose access to certain archived records was, Poirot assured him, reliable and discreet. He had also asked Perkins to bring him the household accounts from the previous 5 years. He had examined these for 40 minutes with the focused attention of a man reading not numbers but narrative, and had found in them something that confirmed rather than revealed, because by now he had very few things left to verify. At 10 o'clock, the drawing-room of Ashenden Court contained the following people: Desmond Falconer, Miriam Falconer, Colonel Archibald Trent, Roland Ashby, Miss Isabel Quince, Captain Renwick Sloane, Inspector Crail, Constable Meadows, and Perkins, who stood near the door in his customary position of official neutrality, and Hercule Poirot, who stood before the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, and regarded them all with the steady, compassionate attention of a man who has learned that the truth is nearly always more complicated and more sorrowful than the crime. "I thank you all for coming," he began, in his precise, accented English. "I will be brief in some matters and detailed in others. I ask that you reserve your questions until I have finished." He paused to allow this to settle. "The Countess Valeria Sathmari Renwick did not disappear last Thursday night. She left. There is a distinction of considerable importance between these 2 things, and I want you all to hold it in your minds as I proceed." Several faces shifted. He continued. "She left through the eastern garden door, for which she had obtained or retained a key. She left with one person, whose shoe impressions are alongside hers in the garden border. She left in a motor car that was waiting in the lane beyond the eastern wall, which motor car was heard by a witness at 11:45, and she left carrying a black lacquered box containing papers of private importance." He looked around the room. She left because she had received, 4 days earlier, a letter of threat. Not a new threat, an old one, renewed. The threat referred to events of the summer of 1928 at the Renwick estate in Dorset, events concerning the death of Gerald Renwick Sloane. He heard the intake of breath, more than one, and continued before any of them could speak. Gerald Renwick Sloane died in August of 1928. He was 38 years old and apparently healthy. He died on an estate occupied at that time by himself, by Lord Renwick, and by the woman who was then Lady Renwick, the Countess. His death was determined to be a heart attack. He was the primary heir to the Renwick estate. He paused to let the chronology settle. "I will not tell you today precisely what occurred in August 1928. I tell you this. The Countess received a letter suggesting that someone proposed to speak about it, and the Countess, being a woman of intelligence and considerable strategic capacity, did not panic. She invited certain people here. She engaged her solicitor to revise her will. She spoke in advance to the one guest she trusted most, asking him to observe carefully, and she prepared, at a moment she had calculated in advance, to leave this house voluntarily, to meet whoever had written that letter, and to settle the matter on her own terms." Colonel Trent's face had gone through several colours since Poirot began speaking. It had settled into something between grey and red that was not healthy in a man of his age. "The letter," Poirot continued quietly, "was from you, Colonel Trent." Chapter 12. The Colonel confesses his particular silence. The silence in the drawing-room had the quality of held breath, sustained, brittle, carrying the anxiety of people who do not know whether to look at the Colonel or away from him. The Colonel himself did not move. He sat with his large hands flat on his thighs and stared at the carpet between his feet. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its volume, the first time, Poirot suspected, that it had done so in many years. "I was at Dorset that summer," he said. "You'll have found that. I had it confirmed this morning. I was Gerald's friend, best friend, since school. He'd invited me, July to September, as was traditional." A pause. "I saw what I saw." "What did you see?" The Colonel looked up. His face had the quality of something that has been carrying a weight for so long it has deformed slightly around the weight's shape. "I saw her give him something. In his drink one evening. I didn't know then what it was. I didn't have words for what I suspected. Afterwards, when Gerald was dead and they said heart failure, I told myself I had imagined it, or misunderstood it. But you had not imagined it." "No." Flat, definitive. "No, I had not. And you said nothing at the time." The old soldier closed his eyes briefly. Gerald was dead. She was a widow within 3 years. Whatever she had done, or had arranged, the consequence had occurred and could not be undone. And Lord Renwick was alive and old and liked. I did not see what good it would do." "The silence served you," Poirot said gently, using the phrase from the letter. The Colonel flinched. "Not in the way that sounds. I took nothing from her. I asked nothing. I simply remained silent because the alternative was accusation without certainty, upheaval without remedy." His hands clenched. "I have not been comfortable with that silence in 30 years. What changed? I am 67 years old. I have a doctor who takes a serious view of my heart. I began to think about what I would leave behind, what I would leave unaddressed." He straightened slightly. "I wrote to her. I told her I intended to speak. Not to the police. I am not certain enough, after 30 years, to go to the police. But to the boy, to Archie Renwick Sloane, because he has a right to know what his father's death was, and at whose hand." Captain Renwick Sloane had not moved during this recitation. He sat as though carved from something cold and hard, his face very still. "She knew," Poirot said to the Colonel. "When you wrote, she understood immediately. And she sent for her solicitor, and she arranged her affairs, because she knew that you, whatever else you were a man of integrity who would not be bought or threatened. I would not. And she chose to meet you, not to fight you." Poirot turned slightly toward the captain, because she had decided it was time. Because whatever she had done in 1928, she had perhaps spent 30 years with it as well. The captain said, in a voice stripped of everything but the question itself, "Are you telling me my father was murdered?" "I am telling you," Poirot said carefully, "that there is reason to believe his death was not natural. I am telling you that the woman who may have been responsible is now missing, and that she left voluntarily, with, I believe, the intention of meeting Colonel Trent, who had arranged a rendezvous through their telephone conversation on Wednesday evening." All heads turned to the Colonel. "She called me back," he said, "after my letter. She said she wished to speak before the others arrived. She proposed that I come to the house, and that she would come out to meet me in the garden, late, when the house was quiet, so that no one else would be involved. She said she had something to show me." He looked at his hands. "Something in a box. And you agreed?" "Yes. And last Thursday night, at approximately 11:45, she came to the eastern garden. And you were waiting in the lane, beyond the gate." "Yes. And she opened the gate with the key she had kept, and she came through." "And you and she walked to the motor car?" "Yes. Where is she now, Colonel Trent?" The old soldier's face went through a final transformation, from resignation to something that looked, unexpectedly, like relief. "She is," he said, "at my house in Gloucestershire. She went there of her own will. She is in good health. She is, to the best of my knowledge, considering what she intends to do next." Inspector Crail rose to his feet with the expression of a man who has been sitting on a very compressed spring. "I will need your address in Gloucestershire, Colonel." "I'll write it down," Trent said quietly. "And I'll say this, She went freely. Whatever she has done, she went freely, and I did not threaten her, and she is safe. Chapter 13. The Truth in the Lacquered Box. Inspector Crail telephoned the Gloucestershire Constabulary at 11:05. By noon, confirmation had come that the Countess Valeria Sathmari Renwick was indeed present at Thornfield House in the village of Coombe Parva, in good health, apparently unharmed, and, according to the local constable who had spoken with her briefly at the door, entirely composed. She had asked, through the local constable, that Hercule Poirot be told she would return to Ashenden Court the following morning, and that she wished to speak with him alone before anyone else. Poirot agreed to these terms with the equanimity of a man who has been making himself available to the truth for 40 years and sees no reason to alter the practice now. That afternoon, the atmosphere at Ashenden Court settled into something complex. Not the electric tension of a mystery unsolved, but the heavy, accumulated air of a house in which a great deal has been revealed and a great deal more remains to be resolved. Captain Renwick Sloane took a long walk alone on the grounds and returned looking hollowed out in the way that people look when they have been carrying a structure of assumptions about their past, and that structure has been dismantled at the foundation. He said nothing to anyone. He ate nothing at dinner. He sat in the drawing-room afterward with a glass of whisky he did not drink, staring at the fire with the expression of a man reviewing the entire inventory of his life. Miriam Falconer, freed from the necessity of performing ease, stopped performing and simply sat with her husband, which was perhaps more genuinely companionable than anything they had managed since their arrival. Desmond Falconer, for his part, sat in the library until very late, going through papers. What calculations he was making, Poirot did not inquire. Roland Ashby sketched in his room. He showed Poirot the sketch the following morning, a quick study, done from memory, of the Countess's face as it had been at dinner on Thursday evening, watchful, intelligent, carrying something that might be preparation or might be farewell. Miss Isabel Quince moved through the house with the careful efficiency of someone managing the aftermath of a thing she had half anticipated. She was efficient with the household. She was kind to Perkins. She said nothing unnecessary to anyone. The Countess arrived at Ashenden Court at 10:15 the following morning, in Colonel Trent's motor car, driven by his man. She wore her dark wool coat. She carried the black lacquered box under her arm. She looked, Poirot thought, when Perkins admitted her to the hall, not diminished by the events of the preceding days, but rather clarified, the way a face that has been carrying a long tension is sometimes clarified by the release of it, even when the release is not comfortable. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, with the composure of a woman greeting an expected guest, "shall we go to the small sitting-room?" They sat across from one another, and she placed the lacquered box on the table between them and unlocked it with a key from her pocket. "I understand," she said, "that you have told them most of it." "The structure," Poirot replied. "The interior content. I preferred to wait for you." "The interior content," the Countess said, "is this." She opened the box. Inside, arranged with care, were documents, letters, a sealed envelope, old, with a doctor's name on the return address, a notebook in Hungarian, 3 photographs. "In August 1928, the Countess said, in a voice as steady as if she were recounting a passage from a book, "Gerald Renwick Sloane did not die of a heart attack. He died of digitalin poisoning, a fact I am aware of because I administered it." Poirot did not move, did not speak. "My husband was 61 years old and seriously ill and in considerable pain, and Gerald Renwick Sloane had been systematically embezzling from the estate for 3 years, which my husband did not know, and which, had he known, would have shortened what little remained of his life by the shock of betrayal. I found the records in August 1928. I confronted Gerald alone. He laughed. He told me that when my husband died, which would be soon, Gerald would inherit everything, and I would receive the widow's portion and nothing more, and that I should make my peace with this. She did not look away from Poirot as she said it. I made a different peace, she said. He was a thief and a man without conscience, and my husband was dying by degrees and could not be protected. I protected him in the only way I could. I have told myself many versions of this story in 30 years. Some of them are more honest than others. She closed the box. The documents here are the records of Gerald's embezzlement, which I took from his room after his death, and a letter from the doctor, a friend, who suspected the manner of death but agreed, after a conversation I am not proud of, to record it as cardiac failure. He died in 1951. His letter is here because he gave it to me at the end of his life and said that what was done with it should be my decision. She paused. And the photographs are of my husband, in the last year of his life, happy, which he could not have been had he known. Poirot looked at the box. He looked at the woman. "What do you intend to do?" he asked. "I intend to give this box to Captain Renwick Sloane," she said. "I intend to tell him what I have told you. I intend to tell him about his father's theft, which he deserves to know, alongside the rest. And I intend to tell him that his inheritance, which I had proposed to change, will in fact remain as it stands." A pause. "Because whatever Gerald was, Archibald is not his father, and a man should not pay for crimes he did not commit. And the will revision? A portion will go to Colonel Trent, because silence has cost him more than it has cost me, and I have not adequately acknowledged that." She met Poirot's eyes. "And a portion to Isabel because she has served me loyally and deserved better than service." Poirot was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, carefully, "There will be questions regarding what happened in 1928. I know. Inspector Crail will need to be informed. I know that too." She looked at him with the clear, measuring gaze of a woman who has arrived at a decision through long deliberation. "I am 63 years old, Monsieur Poirot. I do not intend to run further. I intended, in going to Archibald Trent's house, only to think clearly for 36 hours without an audience. I have done so. I am here." She straightened slightly. "Whatever happens next, I will face it on my own terms." Chapter 14. The Weight of the Little Grey Cells. Inspector Crail was, as Poirot had suspected he would be, uncertain. He sat in the morning room with the Countess's statement before him, and the expression of a man who has been handed a case that falls outside every established channel simultaneously. Gerald Renwick Sloane had died 30 years ago. The doctor who had signed the death certificate was himself dead. The embezzlement records, if examined by forensic accountants, might be authenticated, but they represented the evidence of a woman with every reason to construct a justifying narrative. The digitalin, there was no body to exhume in any meaningful forensic state after 3 decades. "It is," Crail said, putting it with commendable precision, "a matter for people above my pay grade." "It is a matter," Poirot agreed, "that will go to the Crown Prosecution Service and will be decided by persons trained in the weighing of evidence, 30 years old, against the testimony of a 63-year-old woman with an impeccable public record and considerable resources." He paused. "I will, of course, provide my full report. I recommend that you retain the documents from the lacquered box." The Countess surrendered the box to Inspector Crail with the cooperative dignity of someone who has already decided that resistance is not her current strategy. Crail departed at noon. The matter was, as he had said, no longer his to manage. What remained was the human business, which is always the harder business, and which takes considerably longer than the legal variety. Roland Ashby was the first to leave, thanking the Countess with the warmth of genuine feeling and extracting from her, in the front drive, a promise that she would sit for him again in the spring. "I should like to try again," he said, "now that I know what I was looking at." She looked at him with amusement and something else, the particular softness of a formidable woman, regarding someone who has seen her clearly and remained kind. "I don't know that I have changed," she said. "I don't think the change is in you," he said, and got into his car. The Falconers left together after a quiet conversation in the library between Desmond Falconer and the Countess regarding the will, whose revision was now to proceed along different lines than originally planned. Miriam Falconer shook the Countess's hand with the first genuine warmth she had displayed since her arrival, and said, unexpectedly, that she thought the Countess was braver than she seemed, which was itself a brave thing to say to a woman of the Countess's bearing. Colonel Trent was the last of the guests to go. He and the Countess stood in the entrance hall for a long time without speaking, in the manner of two old people who have negotiated a long overdue clearing of accounts, and are standing in the space left behind. "I did not wish you harm," he said at last. "I know," she said. "I could not remain silent forever." "I know that too." She extended her hand. He took it and held it for a moment. "Gerald was not a good man, Archibald. I wish you had known it sooner. I wish," she added, and her composure held but only just, "that I had found a different way." He said nothing. He nodded once, and he went. Captain Renwick Sloane remained at Ashenden Court for 2 more days, during which he read the documents in the lacquered box twice through and sat for long periods in the library and took his meals alone. On the morning of his departure, he found Poirot in the entrance hall putting on his coat. "Was she wrong?" he asked, not rhetorically, with the genuine openness of a man who has spent 2 days trying to reach a verdict and cannot. Poirot buttoned his coat with care. "She committed a crime," he said. "Whether she was wrong, that is a question that belongs not to me, but to the 30 years she has carried it, and to whatever judgment is offered by courts or by the quiet of an honest conscience." He looked at the captain steadily. "Your father was a thief who stole from an ailing man and would have stripped a widow of her security. Your father was also a human being. These facts coexist without resolution. Most true things do." The captain was quiet. "Then, what happens to her now?" "The Crown prosecution will decide. The evidence is old and incomplete. She has made no attempt to evade or deny. She is 63 and has spent those years in, as far as can be determined, genuine moral anguish." Poirot picked up his hat. "I cannot predict what courts will do. I have long since ceased attempting it. But I will say this. She is a woman who faced what she had done, in the end, with more courage than many possess." The captain nodded slowly. "I find I cannot hate her. That," Poirot said gently, "speaks well of you." He went to find Miss Isabel Quince, who was in the small sitting-room with a cup of tea and the particular expression of someone who has arrived, after great effort, at a state of provisional equilibrium. "Mademoiselle Quince," he said, "you will remain with the Countess for as long as she needs me." She looked up. "Will they prosecute her, do you think?" "I cannot say. The evidence is ambiguous. The passage of time complicates everything." He sat, briefly, in the chair across from her. "She is fortunate to have someone who has stood by her without being asked." "I wasn't asked because she didn't know I knew," Miss Quince said. "I would have stood by her regardless. She is, whatever she is the best person I have known." Poirot regarded her with the warm gravity he reserved for people who possessed, in their quiet way, a loyalty that shamed the louder varieties. "You have," he said, "the most important quality a human being can possess. You know the difference between a person and their worst act." He found at last the Countess herself in the garden. The October morning was cold and clear, the wall casting its long shadow across the bare borders. She stood near the eastern gate, which was locked again, its key returned to the estate office, and looked at the limestone without, apparently, seeing it. She heard him approach and did not turn. "You solved it," she said. "You gave it to me," he replied, "in your way. The choice to leave openly, through the garden, leaving your jewels arranged as though you intended to return. You were telling a story, not to deceive the investigators, but to give yourself time and control." He stood beside her. You left the novel open at a page about revelation. You spoke to the painter about good eyes. You engaged the solicitor to revise the will, not because you had decided what you wanted, but because you wanted it known that you were in the process of deciding. You were setting a stage. One cannot always outrun the past, she said to the wall. But one can, Poirot said. Sometimes face it on one's own terms. Yes. She turned to look at him. In the cold morning light, she looked her age, and at the same time younger than her age, the paradox of a person who is, for the first time in a long while, not hiding. "Did I do right?" she asked, not expecting an answer, simply asking into the air, the way people ask when they are no longer asking the question that is on the surface. "You did what you did," Poirot said. "The question of right. It is above my department, madame. My department is the truth." He inclined his head, his small moustaches perfectly level. "And the truth, in this case, is complicated and sad and human, as it generally is." He left her in the garden and walked back through the house, pausing in the entrance hall where the pale suede gloves still lay on the silver tray. He stood in the hall for a moment as he had stood on his arrival, still, attentive, listening to the particular silence of a house in which a mystery has been solved, but nothing has been entirely resolved. This, he reflected, was the nature of the work. The little grey cells could arrange the facts, could illuminate the architecture of a crime, could determine what had happened and who had done it and why, but they could not tell you whether mercy or justice was the more appropriate response, and they could not undo 30 years of consequences, and they could not make a son feel differently about his father, or a woman about her choice, or a soldier about his long and costly silence. Poirot put on his hat. He buttoned his coat. He picked up his small case. Perkins opened the front door with the expression of a man who has, against considerable odds, maintained his professional dignity throughout an extraordinary week. "Your motor car is waiting, Mr. Poirot." "Thank you, Perkins." He paused in the doorway, looking out at the October morning, the gravel drive, the elm trees, the pale sky. "You have served this house well." "I have served it as best I could, sir," Perkins said. "As one can only do." "Quite so," said Poirot. "Quite so." He walked to the motor car and settled himself in with the care of a man who values his dignity and his overcoat in roughly equal measure. As the car moved down the drive, he did not look back at Ashenden Court. He rarely looked back. Looking back was for people who had not yet understood what they were looking at. He looked instead at the lane ahead, the elm trees dappled in the autumn light, the village beginning at the bend, the railway station beyond it, and beyond the railway station, London, and work, and the next case, and the endless, inexhaustible, sorrowful, remarkable complexity of the human heart. Hercule Poirot settled his hat more precisely on his head, folded his gloved hands in his lap, and applied his little grey cells, with their customary precision, to the question of what to have for dinner. The end.